Everybody, I would like to welcome Adam Ardrey. He's going to be talking about the historical Merlin case closed. I'm sure he's going to refute everything I just said, which is totally okay. So Adam, if you don't know him already, he is the author of Finding Merlin as well as Finding Arthur. And I had the pleasure of meeting him back when I was doing my trek in 2005. And I went up to Edinburgh and we had a really nice talk and chat. And I'm super happy that he was able to join us today. Take it away, Adam.
Okay. Good morning here. I'm speaking to everyone from Scotland. As I said before, I enjoyed Justin's talk enormously. Got a lot to get through just now, though. One thing I would take issue with Justin when he says, and this is what people tend to say all the time, now we'll go to London, the home of Merlin. That's what we've been up against, those of us who are interested in the history, all these years, because what has happened is that Arthur has been portrayed as a Christian English king when he was not a Christian, was not English, and was never a king. And so what I'm going to try and talk to you about today is, well, Merlin, but I hope you can see in the screen. Justin, can people see in the screen the bit that says "Found Robin, where is Batman"?
It's looking,
okay.
It's looking perfect.
Okay, so this is the thing. Found Robin, where's Batman? What is the point of having a Robin figure? You would say that can't be the real Robin because Batman comes with a Robin, Robin comes with a Batman. The same thing applies to Arthur and Merlin. If I were to say to you today, yeah, I found Merlin, you would say, well, we need to have an Arthur attached because otherwise, what do you have? All you have then is just another avuncular old man, and there are lots of them around about in history. So I'm going to say to you in a second, just bite the bullet and identify exactly who Arthur was. Arthur was Arthur Mac Aedan, about the only historical character in the age of Arthur who actually comes with that name. But even if that were not true, we know where he was and we know when he was there. Where he was in 574 was on the hill fort of Donad. And the photograph you can see there is of the stone on the summit of Donad Hill. Donad Hill is in the west of Scotland. It's in the beautiful Argyll countryside. And it was where the Scottish kings were inaugurated. They were not crowned. The Scottish kings weren't crowned until a lot later. They were inaugurated on the top of Donad Hill. And one of the steps, literally one of the steps you took before you were recognised as the king was to place your foot into the footprint you can see there and be given a sword the same way as the Queen would be given a sword at her coronation. And then when you step out of the footprint, holding the sword, you literally take a sword from a stone. No magic, nothing of the supernatural at all involved in it. It was a simple ceremony that effectively proved you were the king, because if you controlled Donad, the centre of the kingdom at that time in the west of Scotland, you could only become king by actually controlling Donad, and that was symbolised by putting your foot into the footprint. One of the other steps that would be taken would be, because the people around about that area at that time were partly Pictish, partly Scottish, Scottish people having come from Northern Ireland with Arthur's great-great-grandfather, Fergus. He brought with him the Stone of Destiny, the real Stone of Destiny, which was about 18 inches high. It is not that rock that we have in Edinburgh Castle these days, and upon which just about every monarch in the United Kingdom has been crowned for years. The real Stone of Destiny was brought to Argyll by Arthur's ascendant. He also brought with him, as you would imagine, when you're putting your foot into this footprint and being given a sword to hold, a rather special sword. Not magical, nothing's magical at all in anything I have to say. More the bringing into the history here, what people call magic or the supernatural or religion, except as it bears upon the history. They brought with them a symbolic sword, obviously not a sword you would use fighting day to day. It would be like the sword that the Queen has at her coronation, a ceremonial sword. Originally, the legendary Arthur's most famous sword was called not Excalibur, but Caliburn. And then the X was added on later. Caliburn comes from Cal, Caledonia, and Iber, Hibernia. It was the sword brought from Ireland to Scotland. X means from, and over the years, because they needed a name for the sword, we get Excalibur. And it was probably thrown away into the water symbolically at some point by someone, but who knows? No magic was involved. So there you have, bear in mind, an Arthur, 574, at a place called Dunad. Now, when people are looking for Arthur, what they often say is, how will we know? What's the litmus test? The litmus test for Arthur is often said to be Badon. Now, if anyone wants to Google this later, it's B-A-D-O-N. Badon was Arthur's most famous battle because it was mentioned in the 4 earliest historical sources. It was mentioned in Nennius, Gildas, and in the Welsh Annals. Badon, Badon, Badon. No one has been able to find Badon, never, not once, not ever, except if you look in Scotland, you will find there is a Badon, and I'm trying to just turn this over. That rock you see there is Dunad. That's the hill fort. The top of the hill fort is the stone I showed you just a moment ago with the footprint cut into it. And that's Dunad. The land in front of Dunad, in other words, if Arthur had taken Excalibur, or at least the sword that became Excalibur, and thrown it, he could pretty well have thrown it onto land that still to this day is on Ordnance Survey maps and on Google Maps, and it's called Badden, B-A-D-D-E-N. Over the years, anyone who has any interest in this period of history will tell you that names are fluid things. Badon is what it's called today. Originally, it was called Badon, and that came from originally B-A-O-D-A-N, Baldon, who was a cousin of Arthur's. Lots of the places around about were called after various people. Lorne, for example, was called after Arthur's uncle, I think it was. So you've got an Arthur, 574. At least I would ask you to accept a reasonable explanation for the sword and the stone event. And smack bang next to all of these things, you've got a place called Badon. And I would suggest to you that there, in the past, 5 minutes, there is more evidence for an historical Arthur than anything you will ever find south of the border. That is down England or Welsh way. And that's it. So what has that got to do with Merlin? And what it's got to do with Merlin is that if you left Dunad Hill, which you can see there, and walked over the ground there for about 2 kilometres, you would come to a place called Dun Ardrey. And that's why I got interested in this whole subject in the first place, because I had no interest at all in Arthur or Merlin. Nothing particularly interested me about Arthur and Merlin. It was just a Southern English story as far as I was concerned. But I knew that Dun Ardrey existed. That's the hill fort of the Ardreys, which is my second name. And I knew that Merlin, the very, 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 very first ever written reference to Merlin, had him at the, let's get this right, Battle of Arderydd in 573. Now, I step back. The very, very first reference to Merlin has him at the Battle of Arderydd in 573. Arthur is at a hill fort called Dun Ardrey in 574. So you've got 573, 574, two places with an Ardrey connection, and an Arthur and a Merlin. And you've also got a sword and the stone explanation bundled in together with all that evidence, and Arthur's most famous battle, and all within 2 kilometres, because just south of Dunad, 2 kilometres of ground called Badon, the legendary Arthur's most famous battle, and then you come to Dun Ardrey, the hill fort of Dun Ardrey. And anyone who has any interest in the Arthurian legends will be telling you that over the years they've been looking for the famous Mount Badon. Mount Badon is where the hill fort Dun Ardrey is. Now it says there, the earliest reference to Merlin is at the Battle of Arderydd in 573. Arthur Mac Aedan was at a place called Dun Ardrey in 574. And I ask you, fairly pure coincidence? All of that is just pure coincidence. Now, let's see, the next one is, oh yeah, now I'm going to go as fast as I can through Arthur to get to Merlin, which is the point of this, but what I'm trying to impress upon you is that this is a problem that we have because the traditionalists, those who have been writing the history, usually the victors, the most powerful, have been people who were trained in England about what they call British history. Read any British history book and you will find it's almost exclusively the history of England, because people down south have no interest in and very little knowledge of anything outside of England. So here's Professor Alcock's Age of Arthur. In about the 9th century, a monk called Nennius wrote about 12 Arthur battles. Badon was one of them. No one has been ever able, and I would say to you this, if anyone can, let me know. Tell me about an historical Arthur who has an historical connection with any one of those 12 battles. Look at Professor Alcock's map here. You will see that he has, take it from me, this is probably going to be online in due course anyway, 6 battles of Badon. 6. He's got at least 2 Burguions. He has got, let me just see, 1 Caledonian wood, 2 Caledonian woods, both in Scotland, although some people actually try and place them in England, even though they're actually called Caledonian woods. He has 2 battles of Glyne. He's got 2 cities of the Legion, and so on. In other words, it's a dog's breakfast. And if you are to believe that there's an historical Arthur in Professor Alcock's Age of Arthur, you've got someone who in the 6th century or the 5th century, because Professor Alcock doesn't pin him down to an actual time, I do, 559 he was born, 596 he died. Professor Alcock's Arthur would have been fighting from Somerset in the south of England over to Norfolk as he works his way north, into Cumbria, and right up into the Highlands. Now, that is just totally and utterly preposterous. However, if you look at the real history of, that's my book, Finding Merlin. I only wrote these books because I found these connections because of my name. And I emphasize in the books that there is nothing special about my family, except to me. Nothing special about my family name. That kind of road, special families, special things, Da Vinci Code nonsense, supernatural. You can end up being religious if you start along that path. I have nothing special to say about my name. It was a pure coincidence that led me to look in a book that no one else had looked at because no one else had an Ardrey surname. That's all. And now I move on. Here's my map. Now, I'm not sure if you can see that. This is the map I put into Finding Arthur, and you will see the 12 battles there. The first one, the Battle of Glyne, is fought in Argyll. The second one, along the side of Loch Lomond. So that's A, B, and C, almost a straight line. What happened was the very first one was fought in Argyll. It was a civil war between the Scots. Arthur's father became king. B, 4 battles. Arthur fought them along Loch Lomond's side. That's the border between the Scots land and the Pictish land. And what's there underneath that letter B on that map is, if you go there today, you cannot miss it. It is the big, big hill at the very end of the Rest and Be Thankful pass that protects Argyll. And what's it called? It's called Ben Arthur, for good reason. And the people who write about this down south say, this is just a poem. Well, why would he have 4 battles? Why would he just make up another 3 instead of using the same name over and over again? Because it was 4 campaigns against the Picts, all of which he won. And then we go to C, which is the capital of the Picts, and that's the end of the first campaign. Now, tell me this. Look at D, E, F, and G. All of them are in a straight line. They all run from where Arthur's headquarters were, around about Stirling at that time, right down to the Scottish border. Anyway, we're not here to discuss Arthur, we're here to discuss Merlin. What I'm saying to you is that at this time, when Arthur was carrying out these wars, this is why he's famous. Merlin was in Glasgow at that time. He was the Chancellor, he was a politician, and it was him that recognised Arthur's martial abilities. And that's why the two of them are linked together at that time. If it hadn't been for Arthur and Merlin winning the Great Anglo War, there would be no Scotland today. What we would have would be a greater England. Because this all happened at the time when the Angles, the English, were attacking from the east. In the south, they pushed the native Britons far to the west, to Cornwall and to Wales. But the main landmass became England. In the north, they failed. Why did they fail? Because they were pushed back by Arthur and Merlin working together. The politician and the soldier working together. And what happened after that, when 50 years after Arthur's death, the English captured Edinburgh, the British refugees went south, they took with them the stories they had. They're not going to sit round the campfires and say, I'll tell you about the time we were beaten by the English. They spoke about the time when they won battles under Arthur and Merlin. And the people down south thought, we got beaten by the English, so we'll adopt these stories. And that's why so many of the stories exist down south, but have no particular time, have no particular place. They're spread out all over the place, and it's a dark age, and he probably didn't exist. And that's because they're looking in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let's move on. Oh yeah, I'm going to just skip over this bit a bit because I have no idea how much time I'm using. But Camelon, the legendary Arthur, is said to have died at a place called Camlann. And you'll find that that, again, is like everything else in the south, in England and in Wales, all over the place. No Arthur attached to any of it. This one does. It's Camelon in Falkirk, just west of Edinburgh, south of Stirling. Camelon in Falkirk is where Arthur died. Now, how do I know that? Because if you go to the 9th tee of Falkirk Golf Club, you're standing on a fort that used to be called Aedan's Fort, Corained, Kaya Aedan. Arthur's father was Aedan. So I was there one day and I was thinking to myself about Camlann. Why Camlann? Why is it called Camlann? Why was this battle called by that name? And I realised then, if you look at the right-hand picture, it's an image of a Roman fort. At the top left-hand corner, that's the 9th tee of Falkirk Golf Course now. But 1,200 feet south of that were 4 massive ditches that you can perhaps just see there at the bottom. massive Roman ditches that were still there until the 17th century. So you can imagine what they were like in Arthur's day, about 150 years after the Romans left. Cam means twisted or crooked. Lan comes from the same root as land. Camlann means twisted land. And when they were there at that time, and in fact, if you'd been there in the 17th century, you would have seen massive ditches 20 feet deep that only really the Romans could have built. The twisted land was where Arthur made his last stand. That is another story for an Arthur day, perhaps. But Camelon is exactly where he would form his battle line on the line of the old Roman fortifications. To no avail on that occasion, he died. And after he died, where did he go? He was taken to the west of Scotland, and there is written evidence to the effect that Arthur Mac Aedan's family burial plot was on the Isle of Iona. Now, Iona is an island set in the Western Sea. Anyone can look at it. It's where the Scottish kings have been buried. Macbeth is buried there, supposedly. Supposed to be 138 Scottish kings have been buried there. It was a sacred site before the Christians came along. Arthur's family were buried there, and there's corroborative evidence to that effect because his father was not buried there. Everyone was buried there except for Aedan. And the reason Aedan wasn't buried there was because he was an enemy of St. Columba. And Aedan would not be buried there. He was buried down at Kilkerran at the south of near Campbelltown. Everyone else was buried there. The legends say that Arthur was taken to the mysterious Isle of Avalon, set in the Western Sea. Where have they got a western island in the south of Britain? They can't possibly go to Anglesey because that was the place where the Druids were. Bardsey Island, tiny wee island with no connection with anyone. Iona has a connection with Arthur. His family burial plot was there. Anyway, if you look down at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a little chapel called Relig Oran, and that is where Arthur was buried. And we know that because Oran is the Gaelic for a song. And any time that you see in the records something to do with songs, you used to say bards, it's a cover-up for the fact that these were Druids. You say the poets did this. It wasn't poets, they were Druids. The Druids we couldn't talk about because they were a threat to the Christian priests. Oran means song. He was actually buried alive by St. Columba, who's supposed to be the dove of the church. But life wasn't quite, well, what Oran said when they were burying him was, life is not the way you say it is, Columba. And neither it was. Now, to the point, here we are now in Glasgow. Merlin was a man of Glasgow. His name wasn't Merlin. I mean, probably everyone knows that it was Murden originally. But anyway, the important thing was, I said to you earlier, that Arthur and Merlin, Merlin being the politician and Arthur being the warlord, got together for a period of time to push back the Angles. That was in one massive campaign in what I have called the Great Angle War. But before that and after that, there was a lot going on. And what was going on was, at that time, the chap that Justin mentioned to you, what was his name? Kentigern, he was called. Ken just means a chief, and Tigern is like a master or teacher. Kentigern was just like, headmaster's not right, that's got too many school connotations. Kentigern was like big leader, something like that. But his real name was Mungo. Mungo came to Scotland and, came to Glasgow from Dulcerf, about just 45, 50 miles to the east. He brought with him his Christianity, and he found in Glasgow there were two forms of Christianity. The Angler Christians, who were the far right fanatics, and the Tellier Christians, who were more liberal, more moderate people. Both of them, however, were, bottom line, Christian. And that meant they were, and this is where what Justin was saying earlier, what do we have to offer the 21st century? We're just getting back to where we were before 1500 years ago. Because before the advent of Christianity, women had a proper place to play in society. They had the respect of being allowed power. And that's something that hasn't happened for 1500 years since then. Also, gay men had a place in society too. It was no big deal. And it only just dawned on me when I was preparing for this, because of what's been in the news and everything else in the past year or so. So did transvestite men. Back then, 1500 years ago. And if anyone's interested at the end, I'll tell you about that. But what we had was the beginnings, or at least not the beginnings, we had the culmination of a liberal society where men and women, gay men and transvestite people could all get along. And you know what happened when Christianity began to take power. Women were put into a second tier at the very least. Gay men were almost ostracized from society, and so on and so on. Anyway, Merlin and Arthur, and most importantly, written out of history because she was a woman, Merlin's twin sister. She was the brains behind the operation. Her name was Gwyneth, which just means like fair one, something like that. But she was known as Languoreth, the golden one. She was known as the Swan-necked woman. And she was known as the Lioness of Damnonia. She was Queen of Cadzow and Strathclyde, but these are just titles that anyone can be given and anyone can have taken away. But she was the brains behind the operation. She was the one that was able to control the more volatile Merlin, the Lioness of Damnonia, written out of history simply because she was a woman. Now, you'll see on the right-hand side there's a photograph of a lamppost. You'll find many of them in Glasgow, and the Fish in the Ring. The Fish in the Ring is part of Glasgow's present coat of arms, and it commemorates a story told about an adulterous queen. Now, Languoreth was an adulterous queen, no doubt about that. But St. Mungo tried to get rid of her because she was everything he disliked. She was a woman with power, and a woman who was sexually active and not too bothered if anyone knew about it. So he tried to get rid of her. And then we have this, I'm not going to bore you with this silly story about him pulling a salmon out of the river and cutting it open and finding a ring and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not going to get into here just now either, that you will perhaps say, but he was on the Queen's side in the legend told. And that's because the Queen beat him. Languoreth beat Mungo. And so Mungo, who had been trying to destroy Languoreth, suddenly said, I was on her side all along. It's like listening to Donald Trump these days. Just change the story, change the history. But if you read the stories carefully, you can see quite clearly that Mungo was not on the side of the Queen. Now, where we have, so twins. This is how I know where Merlin was born, because his sister was born in Cadzow, Hamilton, about 4 or 5 miles from where I am at the present time. All those oak trees are still there that Justin showed us just a moment ago. And Cadzow is part of Hamilton now, but it wasn't back in the day. You'll see on the right-hand side there's a medieval castle on the site where Merlin's place would be at that time. This is what happens. You see, the sites don't change. If a place is a good place for a castle, it's going to be a good place for a castle time after time. I mean, if there was no castle in Edinburgh and you decided you were going to build a castle there, you would build it on the castle rock. The medieval castle, which is now practically falling into the Clyde, is in a beautiful spot, beautiful bridge, and that's where Merlin and his sister were brought up, not far from Glasgow. Of course, they had, because his father was a lord, they had a place in Glasgow too. His father was a man called Morken. Mor just means big strong. And Ken, as I've said before, with Kentigern, means a chief. Morken is probably a nickname. It means big chief, boss, that kind of thing. But Merlin's teacher is a man called Blaise. Now, you go and Google Blaise until your heart's content, and look at my book and see a page about all the different alternatives for Blaise this, Blaise that. They've got them in the north of France. It's supposed to be something to do with a Saint Blaise, etc. Blaise is a corruption of the Gaelic word for blasphemer. And again, that's the name we know him by, because the Christians were successful and the Christians called him blasphemer, and it's corrupted into Blaise. Because if it stayed in the almost unpronounceable to English speakers Gaelic, it would signal this story happened up north, and so we had to change it. He was known to his friends, Blaise was known to his friends, Merlin's teacher Blaise was known to his friends as Cathain, and that means the battler. So like Merlin, who had a name Murden, madman, Blaise was called blasphemer. Blaise had another name, Cathain. Oh, I just remembered, I didn't tell you what Lilacan meant, because remember Justin mentioned he was sometimes called Lilacan. Yeah, Merlin was called madman by his enemies, Murden. Lilacan is a corruption of the Gaelic word, and I can't pronounce it, I don't speak Gaelic. Lilo is a corruption of a word that means something like song, as in Lay of the Last Minstrel, or the German word Lieder. So it means song, and Ken just means chief, boss. Merlin was known to his friends as chief of song, Lilacan. He was known to his enemies as Murden, the madman. Blaise was known to his friends as Cathain, the battler, and as a blasphemer by his enemies. Languoreth, we've already gone through her names, the Lioness of Damnonia. So all these people were active politically in the time of, about the middle of the 6th century. Oh yeah, here we are. So they're there. Morken is the head of the people who eventually opposed the Christians. Merlin, you'll see there it says, leads the Druids of the old way against St Mungo's Christians. Fergus on his cart. This is an image taken from Glasgow Cathedral, Mungo's Glasgow Cathedral. Long story short, what happened was that when Mungo arrived, he brought with him a dead body of a man called Fergus on a little cart. That's commemorated by that pillar. That's the top of a pillar, the capital of a pillar in Glasgow Cathedral. Next to where the cathedral is today, and remember Justin was saying to us a moment ago about Merlin wailing down from a hill across the Moll-and-Dinner burn. That was against Mungo. Now the Moll-and-Dinner burn is still there. So what you've got is a 12th century source that says Merlin and Mungo were together, albeit on the other sides of the burn, at a particular place where Mungo's Cathedral is today, and Merlin was shouting down at him. In other words, they were at odds with each other. So you've got a Merlin in a particular place at a particular time that fits exactly with Arthur's life too. Merlin was born about 540, died around about 618. Arthur's life was shorter. He was a warrior, born about 559, died about 596. What happens here is that hill you can see just on the right, which has now been desecrated by Christian graves, although it is a very beautiful place. It's like Père Lachaise in Paris. It's the Scottish equivalent of it. But in the day, it was a druidic hill where nature would be allowed to run its course. It would have the traditional druidic oak trees, mistletoe. Probably they grew a lot of herbs for medicinal purposes. Because Druids were not, as you might imagine, religious figures, not entirely. Druids were like professional people. So you would have a Druid who would be a lawyer, a Druid who would be a doctor, a Druid who would be a vet, one who would be expert in the weather. Some of them would be religious, of course. But the great thing about them was that women were also allowed to be Druids and had an equal part to play in society. But in any event, they played that part on the Druids' Hill in Glasgow, which is now Glasgow Necropolis, the city of the dead. Mungo arrives with Fergus in his cart, and what does he do? He buries a dead body which was anathema, on the Druids' Hill, and starts the religious wars that we've been having in Glasgow, the religious troubles, wars is too strong, the religious troubles we've been having in Glasgow since then, effectively. Of course, at the same time, Mungo was putting down the moderate Christian faction. In any event, moving on, we've got Merlin is there. Merlin's father is an opponent of Mungo. There are a number of different stories. Mungo raids Merlin's father's storehouses down at Partick and near Govan. It's down at Partick, because it's the usual thing. Mungo couldn't feed his own people, so he sailed down the Clyde and stole the grain from Merlin's father's storehouses. And of course, the story is told that some miracle happened and they were washed up the Clyde towards just nonsense. Bottom line, and here's something that must be true because no one would tell this story if it wasn't true. Morken threw Mungo to the ground in Govan in Glasgow. Oh, Govan, by the way, is called Govan because it was named after Gawain, one of Arthur's warriors. In those days, it wasn't called Govan because Gawain was too young. But in what is now Govan, Morken, Merlin's father, threw Mungo to the ground and gave him what I called in my book a good Glasgow kicking. This was a division that couldn't be healed. Languoreth tried to get Merlin to stay and fight it out in Glasgow, but Merlin was having none of that. He joined his cousin, Gwendolo, the one that you heard about earlier, at Caer Gwendolo, down south. And all the other states is not right, peoples around about got together to put down Gwendolo. It's a wee bit more complicated than that because this is real life. But you'll see there, that's the capital, the hill fort of Caer Gwendolo. Maybe, but in any event, it happened around about that area. That's my son on the top of it, and it's on the Scottish-English border, just north of Carlisle. There was a massive battle there, a big battle. And that's one that is commemorated in poem after poem after poem. John Matthews will know much more about this than I do. But it tells a story of the Battle of Arderydd. After that, it said Merlin went mad. He didn't go mad. This is still the same propaganda we've been getting for years, where he was said to go mad. He lost the battle. He lost the battle, and he headed off into the Caledonian woods. Someone was asking earlier, Justin was saying, where were they? Just about the whole of the southern part of Scotland was the Caledonian Wood in those days, from just south of Edinburgh to right down to Dumfries and Galloway and across to the east too. Merlin went to hide out there, probably around about Biggar. But after a period of time, that was 573 when the Battle of Arderydd took place. Why was it called that? Because one of the peoples who went with the people of Strathclyde down south as an ally was Aedan, father of Arthur Mac Aedan. And in 573, the young Arthur would have been about 15 years old. It's not commemorated as one of the 12 battles that Nennius lists as Arthur battles because Arthur was not in command at that time. He was only about 15 or so at that time. Went south with his father. Arderydd is the name of the battle. Next to it, as Justin was saying, was Arthur At, and just south of that is a place called Arthur Seat. And there are strong traditions there in connection with Arthur. But that comes in later because he wasn't famous at that time. It was only later that people would recognise that he fought a battle there and then. But in any event, this is Merlin's story. Merlin, beaten at Arderydd, heads into the woods, hides out there, negotiates with his sister, who's still in Glasgow, Languoreth, married to Rhydrych Hale, Rhydrych the Good, Rhydrych the Generous, in Glasgow. His sister wins her husband over and negotiates Merlin's return. But the way the story is told, it's as if Mungo was the one that met with Merlin and graciously allowed him to return to Glasgow. Now that's utter nonsense, because Mungo had been exiled from Glasgow himself for causing the religious trouble he caused. And he went down to St. Asaph in the north of Wales. Who was the person connected with St. Asaph's years later? Geoffrey of Monmouth. This is where Geoffrey gets his ideas, because St. Asaph, can't remember, what was he made a bishop, something like that. He had some St. Asaph connection. And it just happens to be the place where Mungo went when he was exiled. Of course, he didn't get along with Asaph at all, fell out with him, came back to the Scottish borders, and then worked his way back into Strathclyde. But the way the story is told, because the Christians were successful, you'll see that from the stained glass window there, is that Kentigern graciously allowed the rough, sort of hairy, wild man of the woods, Merlin, Murden, the madman, as they would have it, back into power, or at least back to Strathclyde. I mean, that's utter nonsense. What happened was that they met there and negotiated a return, but the negotiations would not have been with Mungo. Mungo would have been along for the ride, but it's just the fact that he was in a position. Glasgow, they come then, and it's beginning to be quite clear that the Christians are going to be successful. And you'll see there, this is just a photograph taken on the summit of the necropolis. Roman and Greek and Celtic culture was subsumed by Christian tyranny and superstition, which is in fact the truth of the matter. All these are graves, though. I mean, these are not Roman graves or Greek graves or Celtic graves. The Celtic cross is there. These are all just monuments on the summit of the necropolis today. And on the other picture on the right-hand side, we've got looking down from the necropolis towards Mungo's church. That wouldn't have been there in those days, right enough, but Mungo's, that's the cathedral built a lot later. But Mungo's church would have been in the same spot. So you have to ask yourself, would be, why had someone decided in the 12th century to say all these things if it wasn't true? Because remember, the stories were all supposed to be set down south. And why was it not Bath? Why was it not somewhere in London or Hull or somewhere? Why did they choose Glasgow? They chose Glasgow because the tradition had a foundation in reality. Merlin was there, and he was a Druid. And this next one is Ardrey Street. Remember I was saying to you that I got interested in this because of my second name, and I emphasize again, nothing special about me, nothing special about my name or family, anything like that. It was a coincidence. No one cares about anyone else's family history except the people who have the same family. And that's what led me to go into the National Library, which is just next to where I work, in the Edinburgh, in the Advocates Library, and look at a book that no one else had looked at because no one else had the same name, and made the connection. This Ardrey Street is, if you look at the map of Glasgow, you will see the River Clyde, the River Kelvin, where they join is a place called Partick to this day. Just outside Partick is Ardrey Street, about a mile to the west of the junction of the two rivers. The story is that Languoreth, when Merlin eventually lost to the Christians, he had to leave the town, and she built him a house just outside the town at Ardrey Street. Of the 10,000 streets in Glasgow, the only one called Ardrey Street is exactly the right position. And if you head down Ardrey Street about 200 yards into the river, you will find, well, you won't find it's gone. There used to be there an island. It's commemorated in the name, Glasgow name, Whitinch. White Island. It was the White Island of the Druids where Cathan had his headquarters back in the day. It was dredged away so that the boats could come up the river. But that's Ardrey Street. And this is where a lot of work went into. I'm just about finished here. I'll just tie in with Merlin's grave. Now, I've got that as a possibility. In 1838 or so, at a place called Dunipace, just outside Dunipace, workmen were digging away at what they called a beautiful hill to build the bridge down at Denny. And they found a grave there. It was made of 5 rough-hewn flagstones with the teeth and everything else still intact. No Christian iconography in there at all. What it did have in there was not a sword to commemorate the burial of a warrior. It had a vase. Within it was what they said looked like a wasp's nest. Now, I found the records made by the local school teacher and the local minister who were called to the site. I'm really moving fast now, but that is exactly the place where Merlin would have been killed. It was 2 miles west of the hills of Dunipace, that you can see one of them on the right. They were like the United Nations of, even from Roman times, right up to 500 years after Merlin's time. The hills of Dunipace were like the UN of Scotland. That's where you got together in the centre of Scotland to work out your grievances. Merlin was heading from Glasgow towards them when he was assassinated. The records that were referred to earlier, the Sylvestris Justin mentioned, says this happened 30 miles from Glasgow at a place called Drumelzier. I remember Justin mentioned to you the Drumelzier in Stobo, down where the little church is and the little window. That is where Merlin and Mungo met. That gives it its Merlin connection. And later they decided to add on to it the Drumelzier bit. But that's not the real Drumelzier. Again, you can find it on the maps. 30 miles from Glasgow, just as the Sylvestris says, is Merlin's, was killed. And that's where we are here. Now, I had to then find, this is going to be very quick, what did they do with the bones? I went around the place, I met people, I was invited into a house that was built in 1544. There was an old chest there. One thing led to another, no time to go into that just now, but up in the hills is that grave there. Now, it's always been known as the grave, and there might be nothing under it but grass, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that's where those bones were buried. And that's about it. Justin, I can finish there if that works for you, or if you want, I can do a couple of other things.
Let's.
Have I been speaking for 45 minutes?
Yeah, you're perfectly on time.
Yeah.
Hold on,
I'll buzz on, and what to say to people is any questions, if they come through you, anyone get any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. But I'll press on until you tell me to stop.
Yeah, I mean, let's see if we can.
Can I go back there?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I can't.
Does anybody have any questions from the talk so far?
Well, I'll press on until someone does.
Okay, and I'll just stay hidden for a while.
Yep. Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh. Why Arthur's Seat? Why is that called Arthur's Seat? Because remember the map I showed you? The Angles were attacking from the south. They were heading towards Edinburgh. They were stopped in a series of 4 battles by Arthur and pushed back, hence Arthur's Seat. Remember too, I was saying to you that Ben Arthur is exactly where you would put the headquarters of Arthur Mac Aedan if he was defending Argyll against the Picts. Oh, that's just a map from the 1500s. One of the things that got me started, my name's on that up towards the top there. I don't know if you can see the cursor. Can you see the cursor there, Justin? That's Loch Awe, up at the very top, yeah. And that's one of the places called Ardrey. There are quite a few of them around about. And again, I emphasise nothing special about the person that has that name or the family. Oh, that's Merlin's grave at Drumelzier. That's a cover of the first book, Finding Merlin. Finding Arthur was out in 2013. Another one of Merlin's grave at Drumelzier, Dunipace. That's my daughter on the right. This is one. I was at a church ceremony in Glasgow Cathedral. I was at Glasgow University, and my daughter was there as in the army. One of my other daughters was there in the army, and I was looking around about, as I tend to do, and I get a bit bored. And if you look on the second from the right halfway up, if you look very, very carefully, you'll see Saint Mungo standing there like a superhero with a really grovelly, naked, hairy, dirty Merlin grovelling at his feet. Now that's in Glasgow University Chapel. That's about a mile from where Merlin's home was in about 600. That's Badon Hill on the Crinan Canal. You really should go to Argyll. Argyll is stunning. That's the King's Knot in the shadow of Edinburgh Castle. There is piles of evidence from around about the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries that this is where the Round Table was. And they found it in 2011 using that geophysics thing. They went round in a circle. It was actually not a table, of course. It was a mound inside that later garden. But that's been there. And that just happens to be where Arthur's father and grandfather both had their headquarters. So, that's just the St Mungo's Church. That's a view on the top of the necropolis. A stunning place, but could have been better if they'd left it alone. Another one from the necropolis, once the Druids Hill, and that's about us. So, I'll draw a line under that, Justin, if I haven't gone too fast.
No, that's great. We got one question that came in. They said, how great is Arthur as a warrior and leader from your research?
Well, I mean, you only have to look at what he actually did. His base was in Stirling, and the reason that you say that they're the Knights of the Round Table, well, that's all an anachronism. I mean, these were not knights in this medieval sense. If you look at Stirling, it's sometimes called the brooch that holds Scotland together. If the people in the south want to attack the people in the north, then they've got to go through Stirling and vice versa. So if you were literally a freelance, if you had no master, if you were a second son, if you were almost an outlaw and you liked to fight, that's where you went, because before anyone could do any fighting, they had to get past. It was like a buffer state. And that's why you have the stories of the knights coming from all over to fight with Arthur because of their nobility, etc. Nonsense. They went there because that was where the people who held the ring effectively held it. And that's why Arthur was not a king. When the Angles attacked, he had in Stirling the only fighting force that was ready and raring to go. And what happened then was they let him keep charge, provided he kept winning. So he won 4 battles. You saw them in a row there, right down to, Tribruit. Look up Tribruit, if you like. It's one of the Nennius battles. No one can find Tribruit. It's the Teviot. He pushed them back to the Teviot River. So Arthur won those 4 battles. He beat the Picts in about 5 battles. He won a battle the only one he lost of the 12 was Camelon. And that's why you know that the 12 battles are correct, because if someone was just writing them for the sake of it, why not put in the big ending? If you were making a film, you would make sure that you had the big ending, the big battle at the end. It wasn't part of Nennius's list because the poem, the stories had been written before they got that far. So Arthur, well, let me put it this way. I say to you this, there would be no Scotland today if it hadn't been for Arthur Mac Aedan. You don't get much better than that. He's probably the best warrior we've ever had. And we had Robert the Bruce, who is certainly the best warrior we've ever had. So Arthur was at least as good as the Bruce. Anyone else?
Yeah, there's one more that just came in. It's they're saying, you're painting this picture of a clash of 2 worlds, Christian versus the old world. To what extent is this a religious war, and to what extent was it a purely political or socio-cultural war?
Right, it was, to what extent was it a religious war? Well, the Druids, it's like the Romans, people like to have that kind of thing, particularly in days when science was not what it is today and we don't have explanations for things. It was, like the Romans, where the Druids took the view that live and let live, whereas the Christians did not take that view. And you were a heretic if you stepped away from the Christian religion and you were there to be put down. Just look at history and you'll see that. So it was religious to the extent that there's one lot of liberals, that's perhaps putting it too strong, but one lot who were more liberal and another lot who were authoritarian. And so to that extent it was religious, whatever that means. And what it means is it was political and it was socio-cultural, because religion is just political. It's just politics by another name. Unless you bring into it the question of the supernatural. I just don't believe in the supernatural at all. Some people do, fine. But yes, it was religious, it was political, and it was socio-cultural. And the reason it was socio-cultural was Gwendolo. The reason that Gwendolo was opposed by almost everyone was socio-cultural, because when the Angles attacked from the east, the king down there ran away, and a man stepped up like our William Wallace. This man was a man called Emrys. Now, Emrys was just a captain of captains. They did not like that. The one thing that everyone could agree with was kings don't like just ordinary people stepping up and doing the business, because they tend to be better than the kings. But in any event, what Emrys needed was a title. Ken, as I've said, means chief. In the southern British language, it would be pen. Dragon came from the same root. He took the title Pendragon, and the reason he took the dragon name was because the people down that area 100 years before were Sarmatians who lived on the Hadrian's Wall, and they were people who venerated the dragon. So he was chief of the dragon people, effectively, Pendragon. His second leader was Gwendolo, who was known as the other Pendragon, that gets corrupted into Uther Pendragon. And the next great warlord that came along was Arthur, not the son of Uther Pendragon, but just the next one up. They couldn't identify Arthur's real father as Aedan, because that would have shown that the stories were in the north. They couldn't identify him clearly as Gwendolo, for obvious reasons. Gwendolo was just a man of the people. And so you end up with Pendragon. Uther Pendragon is said to be the legendary Arthur's dad. He wasn't. Anyone else?
Someone asked, we don't see a direct connection between Arthur and Merlin until Geoffrey, but you were mentioning a connection earlier. Why do you think that why doesn't this connection appear in any of the earlier Welsh material?
Because Arthur, as I said to you right at the beginning, was portrayed as a Christian English king. And what you have is people portray, the victors write the histories. And so if you've got a guy who was not a king, same way as you have in fairy tales, everybody's a princess, everybody's a prince. Christian, well, he had to be Christian, and he also had to be English, because they were writing the stories down south. So you had that. That's easy to do if you're dealing with a warrior. Arthur was not probably a great thinker, a sort of philosopher. Merlin, it's more difficult. Even today, although you've got all those pictures, and you said in the Sylvestris that Merlin decided to become Christian at the end of the day, what I call marchmaning someone, as from Brideshead Revisited. You take someone who's never been a Christian and eventually you make him a Christian. They couldn't do that with Merlin because he was too associated with the old way of the Druids. And so he is a bit betwixt and between. That's why he ends up a wizard. Arthur, it was easier to do. And so they wanted to keep them separate. You look at the records in the 200 or 300 years after the time of Arthur and Merlin. Arthur is the villain of the piece. Arthur is always doing rotten things to Christians and being punished by the ground opening up, etc., and swallowing him. But the oral tradition was like the internet. They couldn't control it. So after a couple of 100 years, they realized that the people actually like these stories of daring do and action that involve Arthur, and they don't like the sort of boring lives of the saints, so we'll make Arthur a Christian. They couldn't do that with Merlin, but they certainly would keep the two of them apart. Anything else?
Yeah, I think we got one more. Somebody asked, how do you see the marriage of Guinevere to Arthur?
Oh, Guinevere, that's easy. Guinevere, if you look where Arthur was living, his grandfather, Gavin effectively, was thrown out of Argyll and came to the east to Stirling, where he sold his sword and effectively married into the Pictish people who were around about there. After that, his father was there, Aedan, and Arthur was there. Arthur married a Pictish princess. It's called Guinevere, and the Picts were like the Romans. The Picts were like the Egyptians. The titles came with the woman, and so if you married Guinevere, it wasn't that she was, a good-looking girl with a non-smoker and a good sense of humour. That wasn't why people wanted to marry her. If you married her, you got the lands around about there. And that's why Mordred wanted to get her married off after the event. And if you read the stories carefully, you'll see that one of the things that came with the legendary Guinevere was the round table. Now, I've just said the round table was at Stirling. It did come with Guinevere. It came with Guinevere because Arthur married her and got the land that contained what was the circle that people sat in, effectively. And the stories 500, 600 years later, they say that, his father-in-law gifted him a big round table. I mean, that sounds nuts, but it makes a good story, and that's all. So Guinevere was real. After Arthur died, you remember the story, why, you've got to ask yourself, why, of all the people in history, is Arthur the only one who doesn't get the girl at the end of the day? One thing you know about any story is the hero gets the girl at the end of the day, but Arthur is cuckolded by Lancelot. Now, that's nonsense. One, what happened there was not that Arthur's wife was stolen by Lancelot. The figure that became Lancelot, he was the one who married Guinevere after Arthur died. And that's where that story came from. It's a wee bit long to tell, but he did not cuckold Arthur while he was alive. I don't think that would be something that people would tend to do. But Arthur died at Camelon in 596, was taken back to Iona and buried, and Guinevere still had the rights to the land, and so she was married off to someone else, in actual fact an Angle. And he was Christian, and therefore he got written up as the glorious hero who became the Lancelot figure. And in fact, he was the exact opposite of that. But that's about it. Anybody else?
Yeah, one last one.
Okay.
Someone was asking, are you relating the myth of giants to the Pictish people, as Guinevere was half giant?
Guinevere wasn't half giant.
Okay. Easy. I have one more question for you before we go into lunch break. And I'm hoping you have the answer, because I'm very curious. When I was in Partick in 2015, they were just discovering this castle ruins underneath of a new, I think, apartment building that they were doing.
Yeah.
That was like 5 years ago now. I saw that on the news, and I went there, but nothing to see. Have you been following this story? Have they actually found anything? Because that seemed like exactly connected into the story with Ridderic's hunting lodge and all this stuff. It was exactly in Partick.
It wasn't Ridderic's hunting lodge, Justin, because it was too close to Partick. It was actually the Bishop's Palace. And the Bishop's Palace was, of course, it was built and rebuilt over the years. But the stories that we have of Arthur and Merlin are by a man called Jocelyn of Furness, who was an Englishman who was brought in by the bishop in Glasgow and told to write a life of St. Mungo. And what he writes in his book, Jocelyn of Furness says, I went around all the bits of Glasgow getting together all the sources, but they did not say what my bishop wanted to hear, and therefore I have rewritten it in a way that will please the bishop. And that's what I'm saying to you. The stories get changed. But even Jocelyn of Furness, all that I've got, I have to take from Christian sources, because that's all there is. And so that would be where Jocelyn of Furness, the Bishop's Palace at Partick, they're finding the ruins of it now. But that's what was there. That was the Bishop's Palace.
Yeah, I was just curious, have they found any interesting artifacts or relics? Because that seems like an amazing way to find some pieces of history from that exact period of time.
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, you know what Scotland's like. I mean, where I'm sitting at the present time, I could walk to one of what was the biggest castle in Scotland in 5 minutes. I mean, you can hardly move around here. What I'm really saying to you is, see, when all this coronavirus is over, come to Scotland. Also, give me a chance just to say, if anyone wants to speak to me at any time, just email me, Adam Ardrey, all one word, at finding-merlin.com, and I'll answer any questions anyone has, if anyone is interested. Justin, anything else?
I think we're good. Thank you so much. That was a very informative and enlightening talk. It's really good to see this other view of Arthur and Merlin. So thank you for...
Thank you very much for organising this, and thank everyone that's listened for their patience. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.
And thank all you guys for the questions. It's really nice to be able to kind of have some chat. Okay, so I'm going to, Adam, I'm going to say bye to you. Thank you again.